The incredibly heavy, massively reinforced steel door was violently blown completely inward, fiercely crashing heavily against the wet concrete floor with a totally deafening, incredibly massive explosion of sound that shook the entire foundations of the water plant. Caleb aggressively scrambled fiercely out of the rapidly draining, highly freezing pool, violently shivering uncontrollably from the absolute cold and pure, unadulterated adrenaline that flooded his veins. He fiercely grabbed Nora's arm, heavily pulling her aggressively through the violently smoking, entirely destroyed doorway before the unseen architect could aggressively spring another deadly trap on them. They aggressively sprinted blindly down a massively long, highly pitch-black corridor, entirely leaving the terrifying water filtration facility far behind in the darkness. Their heavy, soaking wet boots violently slapped aggressively against the cold linoleum, loudly echoing fiercely through the completely dead, heavily suffocating underground maze. The dark corridor violently ended in a highly expansive, deeply oppressive subterranean barracks, heavily utilized by the former military personnel decades ago. The massive, deeply vaulted ceiling was completely lost in the absolute pitch-black darkness, entirely unsupported by the weak, heavily flickering emergency lights aggressively glowing on the concrete walls. The incredibly vast room was fiercely lined with endless, perfectly straight rows of heavily rusted ancient iron bunk beds that stretched into the shadows. The air here was incredibly thick, violently stagnant, and heavily smelled fiercely of rotting fabric, ancient dust, and deeply dried blood from some forgotten conflict. It was a massive, highly terrifying concrete graveyard. Caleb fiercely gripped his heavy crowbar, violently sweeping his weak, dying flashlight beam aggressively across the terrifying rows of completely empty, deeply stained mattresses, constantly expecting a violent attack from the deep shadows, as Nora aggressively stepped deeply into the central aisle of the terrifying barracks. Her weak flashlight beam violently caught a massive, highly unexpected anomaly, entirely hidden in the dark corner. Stacked aggressively against the back concrete wall was a massive, deeply organized pile of highly modern, entirely brightly colored hiking backpacks that belonged to civilians. They aggressively rushed fiercely toward the pile, completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated dread as they realized the implications. There were exactly 14 heavy backpacks, violently ripped completely open and entirely emptied of their heavy survival contents. Lying fiercely scattered aggressively across the dirty concrete floor were heavily smashed cell phones, violently torn driver's licenses, and heavily broken digital cameras. The highly terrifying, deeply horrific truth violently crashed entirely down upon them. They were absolutely not the first urban explorers to be aggressively lured entirely into this subterranean hell. Nora violently dropped to her trembling knees, aggressively picking up a small, highly dirt-stained leather journal, completely thrown heavily among the destroyed personal belongings on the floor. The highly frantic, deeply desperate handwriting inside violently belonged to a massive, highly terrified young woman named Chloe, heavily dated exactly 2 years ago. Nora aggressively read the deeply horrifying, fiercely scribbled final pages aloud, her voice violently breaking with pure, unadulterated terror. "He absolutely doesn't kill you right away. That's not his rule. The architect aggressively uses the bunker to entirely break your massive mind. He violently controls the heavy lights, aggressively manipulates the massive doors, and entirely starves you deeply in the absolute pitch-black darkness until you aggressively turn completely feral. Don't deeply trust the heavy shadows. The other survivors aggressively hunt for him now, The deeply terrifying realization that the massive bunker was heavily populated entirely by completely broken, highly feral former victims violently shattered Caleb's absolute remaining sanity and confidence. Before he could fiercely process the horrific information, the heavy, incredibly rusted PA system, heavily mounted in the massive barracks, violently crackled aggressively to life with a sickening pop. Instead of the highly synthesized, cold voice of the architect, the heavy speakers aggressively began to violently broadcast a highly horrific, completely deafening audio recording that filled the hall. It was the deeply agonizing, heavily piercing screams of the previous terrified victims, violently begging frantically for absolute mercy, entirely in the dark. The incredibly loud, completely chaotic noise aggressively assaulted their heavy ears, completely and violently masking any entirely subtle sounds of aggressive approach from the deeply terrifying shadows surrounding them. "Cover your ears! Don't deeply listen to it, Nora!" Caleb screamed aggressively, violently trying to fiercely shout entirely over the completely deafening, highly horrific audio assault that echoed off the walls. But Nora fiercely grabbed his heavy arm, her completely wide, highly terrified eyes aggressively staring entirely into the absolute pitch-black darkness exactly between the massive rows of rusted bunk beds. The heavy shadows were violently moving in response to the noise, completely entirely separated from the incredibly loud, chaotic screams playing fiercely on the heavy speakers. A highly distinct, deeply terrifying physical movement aggressively occurred entirely in her peripheral vision. A massive, entirely hunched, incredibly pale human figure aggressively spirit-darted violently between the heavy iron beds, entirely remaining completely just outside the weak reach of her dying flashlight beam. The incredibly fast, highly terrifying feral figure violently lunged aggressively from the absolute darkness, entirely without a single human sound, opening its jaws. It was a completely naked, heavily emaciated former explorer, his complete humanity violently stripped entirely away by absolute darkness and pure starvation. He aggressively tackled Caleb fiercely to the concrete floor, violently knocking the heavy iron crowbar entirely out of his trembling hands onto the ground. The highly feral attacker violently possessed incredibly completely unnatural, terrifyingly raw physical strength, aggressively pinning Caleb deeply to the ground and violently clawing fiercely at his face with entirely heavily broken, deeply jagged fingernails. Nora screamed aggressively in pure, unadulterated panic, violently grabbing a heavy, completely rusted iron pipe from a broken bed frame and aggressively swinging it entirely with all her massive strength at the feral creature's pale back. The heavy iron pipe violently connected aggressively with the feral attacker's shoulder with a totally deafening, incredibly sickening crunch of breaking bone that turned the stomach. The completely horrific creature violently shrieked entirely in pure, deeply feral agony, aggressively rolling fiercely off Caleb and violently scrambling intensely back into the absolute pitch-black darkness of the massive barracks like a completely terrified insect. Caleb aggressively hauled himself fiercely to his feet, entirely heavily bleeding from deep scratches and deeply panting violently as his vision swam. But before they could completely recover from the highly aggressive, terrifying assault, the incredibly loud screams on the massive PA system violently cut entirely off, leaving a dead silence. In absolute, highly terrifying synchronization, every single flickering emergency light, heavily mounted in the massive barracks, violently exploded entirely with a massive shower of aggressive sparks, violently plunging them completely into absolute, deeply inescapable zero-visibility blindness.